And we are live with Sitrep episode 1. Sorry I've been late, guys, but we are back now. We will be discussing the Ukraine war, and I am joined by some wonderful guests and a new one. How are you guys doing today?
Doing fine.
Doing great, thanks.
I'm doing fine as well. Thanks for having me.
That's great to hear. And these wonderful gentlemen and I will be discussing the latest developments going on in this war in Ukraine without any propaganda from the West. And we will just get right into that right now. And I will start with our first front we have here. We have the Lysychansk salient, Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, Bakhmut salient right here. And this is where a lot of the media focus has been as of late, especially Russia's recent refocus on the south in the Crimea areas and in the eastern Donbass after they withdrew from the north and Kharkov area. And this area has been the main focus, especially due to a couple of its strategic areas. As this is the Luhansk Oblast. This line right here separates Luhansk and the Donetsk Oblast, and almost 90% of Luhansk is controlled by Russia. It's only this tiny percent right here that's still controlled by the UAA forces, Ukraine armed forces here. And we have heavy fighting going on right now in Severodonetsk, and the Russians control half of the city, which it was surprisingly heavily populated for how small it is. Very interesting fact there. Also, the city right here is divided between an industrial area and a civilian zone with the residential apartment blocks. That's why it's the front lines are the way they are right now. And we also have a mini Azov. If you remember from Mariupol in our last episode, we have a mini Azov right here which is completely surrounded by Russian and LPR forces, and there's reportedly to be around almost 2,000 civilians in there, if I'm correct on that. And right now, the Russians are firing messages, artillery messages, trying to get them to surrender into LPR territory along this road in the center of town, and not towards Ukrainian territory, because the last time that's been tried in Mariupol hasn't gone very well and just creates more headaches. And there was a lot of Azov members in this plant, as you can tell by its name, Azov, not Azov style Azov, because it's very small. So that is the current main hotspot right now. That is the center of the fighting in this salient right now. Anything you guys would like to add to that?
One thing I'd like to add is that in this salient is where there's the city of Severodonetsk, where at this point the Russians have about controlled 80% of the city. And one of the things that the Ukrainians are at a severe disadvantage at is they're outmatched 10-1 in artillery. And the Russians are using that to great effect against the Ukrainian forces. And in fact, Severodonetsk is important because if they can take it, they can then sort of close this salient and then trap all of these forces that you see in like the right bulge here. And one of the things we've seen in the last couple of days is talk about giving Ukraine the M77 howitzer and HIMARS, multiple rocket launcher systems, in order to match the Russian artillery. But I mean, on paper, this is a bit of a joke because given that they're out, at least at this front, outnumbered 10-1 in Severodonetsk, they're not even getting close to enough to reach parity with the Russians. It's more just of a PR stunt.
Definitely, a lot of those, especially as the ones from Germany as well, just seem like more virtue signaling from the West, as we've seen from the very start of this war of the West, just sending over tons and tons of weapons that are just being destroyed and captured. As there's tons of videos of Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic militia just taking these javelins and SMAWs captured from the West, as well as captured artillery pieces, although not as much because those tend to be destroyed by drone strikes, which the Russians have been putting to good effect, especially in the east currently.
One other thing too is that the troops in Severodonetsk are running short on medical supplies, and So part of Russia's strategy from the beginning in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions was to create these cauldrons where they would surround and isolate and then cut off the supplies of the Ukrainian forces, and then let them run out of ammunition and get attrited before they then moved in with their full forces to stamp out the pocket.
Also, something we need to keep in mind is this river. I believe it's the Donets River, if I'm correct, right here, that runs through Lysychansk area. Or it's the Donets River. All the bridges on this river have been destroyed. So the Ukrainian troops left on the right bank of the Donets River in this slim area, still under Ukrainian control, are pretty much trapped in this area. And the Russians also have artillery control over the roads and bridges in this area. So those don't provide any safety for the Ukrainian troops in Lysychansk either. Situation in this salient just isn't very good either way, as I can tell currently.
The only other thing to point out here is that this is something the Allies in World War II ran into. If you shell a city too much or bomb a city too much, it has the adverse effect. So in World War II in Italy, when the Americans were attacking, I think it was the Gothic line in central Italy, at Monte Cassino, they bombed it to smithereens, but it actually made it more defensible for the German forces there. And while they were eventually defeated, it made the acquisition of Monte Cassino a lot harder than it otherwise would have had to be. And given that Russia right now in Severodonetsk is taking the gloves off and using, heavy artillery barrages not seen since, the Katyushas in World War II, will it create a situation where these cities are actually more defensible? It depends on how well they control the access to supplies coming in and out of the city.
Definitely, supply lines are very important in this war. Ukraine is very large. It's the largest country in Europe. So the supply lines for either side here are very long. And also they're very dangerous, as you can see, because a lot of these roads are in range of artillery. And so your supplies getting into Lysychansk, if you're Ukrainian, can easily be targeted by Russian air or drone artillery all at once. So not very good in that sense either.
So we see that Russia's trying to destroy their supply lines and their forms of communication in order to basically further cripple the city, which is essentially what looks like is going to happen.
Definitely, it seems like that's a goal. Although leveling these cities is not the preferred option by the Russians. Although they could easily, because as we saw in Mariupol, when you start leveling places, that provides lots of cover and places for people and soldiers to hide, and it makes it much more difficult clearing the urban areas, and especially these industrial zones, which is why they take longer to clear, because there's tons of areas for the enemy forces to hide, set up artillery points, maybe mortars. If you know any other reason why these industrial zones are more harder to capture, let me know.
Well, also, since they are industrial zones, if you destroy them, you're just going to have to rebuild them afterwards, and you'd prefer to capture them intact. What it seems to be the case is that the Russians are using their artillery advantage in order to cut off the supplies to the city rather than flattening the city itself. Now, they're not above doing that, as we saw when they shelled out Avastal and Mariupol, if they have to. But it seems like right now they're using their artillery to be more strategic and cut off any supplies coming into the city in order to starve it out.
Yes, taking away the ability to reinforce, to get ammunition, to get more equipment, medical supplies, reinforce everything, like all of the necessities of war. Basically, if you can cut off that from your opponent and also his lines of communication, right? That's incredibly important, and that's how you would take a city. It's just eventually it will have to fall to you, because if it doesn't get reinforcements or any of those necessary equipment, it's over.
Yeah, it's pretty much just like Stalingrad. When your army gets trapped or cut off, like they just starve to death and they run out of supplies and they're forced to surrender. Pretty much the same thing in any modern war scenario. And so we move on to our next front, which I think is interesting to bring up. We have the Kherson Nikolaev front here. And the reason I bring this up is this front has been pretty stagnant as of late, except for some shelling and more artillery being brought up in this area. I believe this town right here is under Russian control, although this map hasn't updated to show that, especially aimed in the city, the port city of Mykolaiv, where the Moskva was built. The ship that sank in the Black Sea a couple weeks ago was built here, as long as many other Soviet ships of the line. And so this gulf right here, the Russians have recently cleared this peninsula right here from any remaining saboteurs or mines, especially in this gulf here. So I think the reason for that, my hypothesis, is to cross this area and take the town of Lokachayev. And this town is surrounded by an estuary and only can be resupplied from one direction. So that if you two were to take this area, it would be a very strategic position, not easily reinforced by Ukrainian forces, and could easily be cut off from two sides here, making the advance on Mykolaiv or advance towards Odessa much easier on this front here.
Now, see, I thought that the Russians would have done that much earlier. I kind of assumed that they would have done that in like the first month. Once they had advanced towards Mykolaiv and essentially were surrounding it on basically three sides. There's that one little road that comes up from the western side. That's where you would want, the Russian naval infantry brigades to come in and take that. So, I mean, from my perspective, I found that very odd as to why that plan was not executed. If they had those forces, maybe they needed them elsewhere, which I'm pretty sure they actually needed them in the Crimea and trying to take Mariupol.
Seemed to me too, as well as the forces at the very beginning of this war. The plan was very built on straws. Putin thought a lot more of the Eastern Ukrainians would be a lot more loyal and just welcomed them in as liberators. That seems to be the thinking from Putin early on, and that was completely disproven. As the Ukrainians a lot more pro-Western than he thought. And also, he just refocused his troops on the east and the south, and they took control of the entire Sea of Azov. So that is a victory for the Russians. They do have that land bridge with Crimea and the water supply from the Dnieper. And so that's all we have on this front currently.
So before we move on, a couple things about the Kherson. So after after Russia's withdrawal from the outskirts of Kiev and its northern position in Belarus, they started to redeploy their troops to the east, to Lugansk and Donetsk regions, in order to achieve their original war goals. Now, that's been slowed down in the fighting around Kharkov, because there's a rail line that's really important for them to directly deploy troops in the region. If they have to go further east, it takes them longer out of the fight. But one of the things that's happened, though, is this freed up troops for Ukraine to plan a counterattack at Kherson. And right now, they're forming up for a counterattack. And a lot of the news is saying that the main things they're considering is how much is the West going to support them. They're already setting it up that if this doesn't work, it's because the West didn't supply them well enough. So they're kind of like, it's a CYA maneuver.
Definitely, we don't know. That's very illogical, as the West has been giving Ukraine insane amounts of weapons to the point of lunacy.
But yeah, just to add on, I do think that what American populist was saying about what the Russians might do is likely to happen, because if they were to to surround the area, they could easily take away Ukraine's access to the sea and just counter them from both sides, which could cause for Kherson. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but it would basically cause for the city to fall, which is why I do think that they could launch this strategy.
I do also think that Russia's long-term goal is to lock down the entire Black Sea region. So if that's the case, I think they're going to wait until they shore up their gains in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions first, because it'll shorten the front, and then hopefully, from their point of view, anchor themselves along the Dnieper River then I think I would envision them deploying to attack the Black Sea regions. Because as we saw with their attack on Kiev, attacking along a wide front without the economy of force, it doesn't work. Because, they made great gains in the south and in the east, but they didn't make very many gains in the north. And part of that is, as well, depending on which Western media outlet you look at, anywhere from 150 to 200,000 Russian troops were mobilized for this invasion, but only like 40% have been deployed so far. So, or maybe like 60,000 Russians have actually seen active fighting. That means there's still a lot more in reserve. And in line with Soviet doctrine, which the Russians are still using, they attack in echelons, usually 3, and each echelon is better trained and better equipped. So all of these gains we've seen Russia making are with like their worst troops and their worst equipment. So we need to keep that in mind as well. The good stuff hasn't been used yet.
The best is yet to come is a phrase that comes to mind when we hear that. Also, another thing I would like to mention before we move on from this front is that a couple weeks back there was news that there was plans for a referendum to be held in Kherson to make it a republic, like Donetsk and Luhansk, although not sure if there's any recent updates on that. They have switched the currency to the ruble, though, in Kherson Oblast, showing more of an intent for permanent occupation, just like in Mariupol. And that brings us to the Kharkov front. This front has been very stagnant. Not very much going on here, although there's been claims from the Ukrainian side of offensives claiming these small villages over here, although I can't verify how contested that was because this area was very hard to predict how many Russian troops were actually here because they never fully secured the approaches to the city of Kharkov itself. They only shelled the outskirts and used their advanced troops here and forward recon units.
Yeah, there were some small Russian gains that I had seen in this region over the past week or so, but nothing major.
So this area is pretty stagnant as of late. And that moves on to the most explosive front, literally and figuratively, and artillery. The Donetsk, Adivka, and Krumatovo front area here. Recently, the front around Donetsk and Avdiivka has been in the news because of how much shelling has been hitting Donetsk recently, and especially a couple of days ago, it was reported that the shelling in Donetsk was 2014 levels or even worse. Not sure who to believe there on that, but apparently very bad. Lots of civilian casualties in Donetsk and the surrounding villages in this area, and around Avdiivka and around these villages here. This area is very, very fortified. It's basically the front lines of World War I, if you want to think about it in any terms. This town here, especially Avdiivka, and around the former Donetsk airport, is basically bunkers, trenches, fortifications, missile batteries, in this whole area. So that's why gains in this area are very difficult for the Russian side.
Yeah, this whole area in Donetsk throughout the conflict has just been inching forward. Like every single Russian gain is always, it looks on the map very, very small. And it's just, day by day, they take another little teeny tiny chunk of it and, inch forward.
Definitely.
I think part of that is, given the wide front on which Russia chose to attack, they've been in the relatively small proportion of their forces that they actually used in the attacks. Some areas you're going to have a lot of gains, like or in the Crimea and in the south, as we've seen, and in the Lugansk region. But because Ukraine is so big, you're going to have either you're going to get turned back, like in Kiev, or you're going to have slow advances, because of the size of the country and the amount of troops you can actually commit to these locations.
And it doesn't help either that this area is extremely fortified. I mean, this is basically 2014 front lines in this area. Basically, very stagnant in this area. Pretty much nothing has changed a lot since 2014 era here. These are some of the original front lines in this area around Donetsk, because I believe there's 14,000 Ukrainian troops in the Divka alone. Could be more than that, just in this tiny area, this little area right here. So that's why it's very hard for the Russians to stop the shelling of Donetsk as much as they would like, because it's very costly and very fortified to take these fortifications around this area here.
Yeah.
And I believe I heard the reason why they're not using their air force as much as they should be is because there's a lot of missile batteries in this area. I believe I'm correct around this area.
So it seems that the Ukrainians are heavily invested in this particular area. But
yeah, there's lots, and especially animosity towards this people in Donetsk.
Yeah.
And the original 2014 conflict.
Yeah.
Also, another thing to mention before we move on around Avdiivka is there is a chemical plant. We're not sure what's stored there, but there is a chemical plant, and there is worry if the Russians were to attack it, the chemicals would leak into Donetsk and kill more people. And I believe the city still does have 1 million, although I'm sure it's a lot less now. It's still around 1 million just in Donetsk alone and the surrounding countryside.
Maybe it is also possible that Russia in the future will probably send in more troops in this area, since this does seem like the most fortified area of Ukraine. So I do think that Russia will have to send in more forces if they actually want to break through.
Definitely, but they do want to support their DPR allies. They were helpful for them in Mariupol, and they are supported by them. So I do believe once they take care of the Severodonetsk salient that we mentioned earlier, they might put more focus on this area, although it's going to be very slow and very difficult. And we move on to what Mr. Pushilin has said. If you don't know, Mr. Pushilin is the president of Donetsk People's Republic right here. And in a recent conference, he stated that Russia's goals are to take Odessa and the city of Kharkiv and all Russian lands, including Donbass. This is what he stated the Russians are very committed to, and seems that they are still firmly committed to these goals, and they are not just bogged down at the moment. They're not just some pie-in-the-sky goals here. It seems they are actually still aiming for these cities, even though this is very stretched supply lines we are dealing with, although Russians haven't fully mobilized their best troops yet, as you mentioned, Praise of Folly earlier. So those haven't been used yet, so those resources could still be very much used for future offensives that are very much planned, probably most likely to take place in the coming or near future in these regions once these salients that I mentioned above are taken care of.
Yeah, and it's important to mention once again of what I originally thought was going to happen as the most likely scenario. And it's funny that this guy Pushilin basically says the same thing, right? Well, I thought that the Russians were going to take what was the eastern portion of Ukraine, east of the Dnieper, and also Odessa, since those were the areas which were the highest concentration of ethnic Russian people. And the highest percentage of Russian speakers. So obviously that is just a geopolitical, area of interest for them. And it makes sense for them to take that, and not to take the West. It's like the perfect min-maxing scenario for them. So I just find that interesting that this guy Pushilin has said the same.
Well, what's interesting here too is one of the reasons why the any offensive towards Odessa and finishing up around the Donetsk region and Kharkiv has been delayed is so many Russian forces were up around Kiev that in April, when they withdrew from that front, they had to redeploy. And that redeployment has been slowed down, as I've said, because one of the key railroads that would be the most direct route to the east is right abreast against Kharkov, which they can't use until they take the city. So they really have to go way out of their way to get the troops from the northern front redeployed to the southern fronts. And also one of the key reasons for taking Odessa is to link up with Transnistria and put pressure on Moldova, which is not a NATO nation, and to control the Black Sea coast, which, as of I think 10 years ago, there was large amounts of natural gas reserves that were found, which in part was what motivated the U.S. to support the Euromaidan protests.
Yeah, especially around this area on the coast of Crimea and around Odessa, huge gas and oil deposits were found, as well as this area, this oblast right here, is a huge producer of wheat that we all like to talk about. Huge producer of wheat that the world needs, especially a lot of countries in the third world depend on for their food imports. And so the Russians control a lot of this area, which is very fertile farmland. As far as I understand, this whole area is very fertile land in the east.
Yeah, that's why I think that it is possible that they could advance and try to get closer to Transnistria, because if they were to obtain access to this land, they would have a variety of resources that would geopolitically benefit them in the world, as then they could use those resources to basically build ties with third world nations that depend on them, which could basically allow for Russia to expand its influence around the world. So, yeah, that's why I think that it is possible that they will try to expand a bit further there.
It's also like you said in Lugansk and Donetsk, you have, as you said, wheat, but also coal traditionally, and also, as of recently, natural gas reserves. So this eastern and far eastern part of Ukraine is very rich in resources. Losing this and the Black Sea coast would kneecap Ukraine and destroy their economy. I mean, they would be a rump state to Poland or something at this point.
Yeah, I believe the state is already very severely in debt or something.
Oh, yes. That. Although I think if I remember correctly, the IMF gave them some loans and bailed them out. So they're getting all of that stuff. I mean, I think they were, at the beginning of the war, they were $1 billion in debt to, it was either the World Bank or the IMF. But the IMF, of course, just basically said, okay, we're going to ignore all of that for now, right? But in the context of Odessa, right, I think that even if the Russians don't take Odessa, their best solution here, obviously, is to take everything east of the Dnieper, right? As I said, so even if they can't take Odessa because the Western aid is too much, or they just don't have the resources or the time to get there, that's still a significant victory for Putin to accomplish all of that.
Definitely, it also finally allowed these oil deposits on the coast of Crimea, which have basically been left dormant ever since the 2014 revolution. I mean, these deposits haven't been able to be touched because of Russia's annexation of Crimea and the ongoing violence in the Donbass. So these resources right here pretty much are untapped. And there might be some in the Sea of Azov as well. But Russians consider the Sea of Azov a historic region to them. And the Russians love their warm water ports, as we all know. Although, do you praise the folly? Is there more strategic reasons for the Russians to want the city of Kharkov so bad, as Pushkin likes to say?
Well, I mean, there's a rail juncture there, but also, I think Kharkov is also an industrial center, so that would be another reason to have it. And the goal is to anchor Russia along the Dnieper River, and so you want to push as far to the west as you can, and so Kharkov is important in a secondary sense with regards to, because the way cities work in countries is logistical hubs of railroads and roads go through the cities, and so in order to advance further west into Ukraine, the way that the logistics have been built out over the last century, it's going to have to go through that city. And you're going to have to take that city to go further west to maintain the kinds of supply lines that you need for a military offensive.
I also believe some of the historic reasons why the Russians want the city of Kharkov is there is a a famous tank factory there called the Red Tank Factory, if I think I'm remembering the name correctly. Although I think it was just bombed at the beginning of this war. There is a historic tank factory in the city of Kharkov as well. Although the city of Kharkov holds significance because it was the capital and the of the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, and is where the Ukrainian communists who supported the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War came from, which is why Kharkov was the capital of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic for a long time. Was for that very reason, was because of its loyalty towards Moscow and its more Russian influence up until 2014.
Right, and of course, Kharkov, like Kiev and Odessa, are like historically Russian cities, and so they bear emotional significance. Right, these are like the crown jewels of Ukraine that Russia wants to take. So obviously, there's an emotional connection there.
It also bears pointing out that Kharkov was important in World War II. It was fought over in 4 distinct battles by the Germans and the Soviets due to its logistical importance. So what's the takeaway here is that with geopolitics, something, even 70 years, 80 years later, these same norms, these same constraints are relevant. So you can read about something that happened 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, and it's still relevant to because the geography hasn't changed. It's still relevant to a modern day conflict. And so it's no surprise that Kharkov is being heavily fought over. It was in World War II.
And I believe in 2014, for a brief time, pro-Russian separatists controlled Kharkov. They even took control of the Capitol building in Kharkov, and there was plans to make Kharkov a republic, like Donetsk and Luhansk, but that failed due to Ukrainian backing and Azov battalion backing to retake this area, along with Mariupol, which the rebels originally captured back in 2014. So perhaps that does hold some significance as well to the Russians due to its previous loyalty to them, recent and in the past.
Yeah, it'll be like a symbolic victory for them if they were to capture it.
It would be. It's the second most populous city. Over 1 million, I'm correct, right? I believe so, over 1 million. It would be a very bloody battle if they were to siege it. A lot more than Mariupol, most likely. And so that brings us to the most recent news. 2 Americans were captured in Donetsk by the DPR. And of course, this brings very bad foreign policy decisions to light, like sending over foreign fighters to go fight in foreign wars, and encouraging young people like the Reddit Battalion, who were blown up as soon as they arrived in the western Ukraine, encouraging people to go die for gay rights, I think is why. So this is also a diplomatic blow because very strategically ruins the image of America, the American empire, to the world, having its, even though they're not official U.S. soldiers, people who are supported by the regime to go over there be captured. Very significant PR blow. I believe they are being tried in Donetsk. A few other foreign fighters were also recently charged, including a British man. They were all sentenced to death in Donetsk. Donetsk and Lugansk have the death penalty pretty much for foreigners. So this also presents a significant bargaining chip for these 2 Americans that Russia could use any way it wants. Perhaps maybe to lessen some sanctions or maybe slow some imports, weapon imports, if you guys have any ideas towards that.
Well, since these aren't officially U.S. servicemen, and given how the U.S. was more than willing to cut and run in Afghanistan last year, they may just cut them loose, because unless it can be turned into some sort of PR disaster by the Russians where they have to do something, the administration currently has shown that it's just willing to cut its losses and throw people under the bus if it feels like it's no longer in their interest to protect them.
Definitely, very much could be. That's what this current regime likes to do very much, especially in these conflicts. That likes to send young men to die for.
Yeah. Just to make a point.
Pointlessly.
Sorry. If the Russians were to like use these Americans as like as a way to get like ransom or something, yeah, I don't think the American government would basically agree to their demands, considering the fact that they are basically determined to weaken Russia, and so I think they'll just let Russia do whatever with them. So
Yeah. And speaking of the equipment stuff, if I can touch on that for a little bit, um, much of the heavy equipment that is being given to the Ukrainians, as we've mentioned previously, is all stuff that's ex-Cold War, ex-Soviet kit. And that trend has basically continued, right? So here's a couple of different things that have changed since I think our last stream a month or two ago, right? I think Hungary has decided to give some old Soviet equipment, like specifically artillery and M113 armored fighting vehicles and some T-72s are in the works. That's a new change, and that stuff is as this source Oryx Spion Cop, which is a Dutch website, and has documented these material exchanges here. It seems like all of that equipment is being funneled, that is coming from Hungary at least, is being funneled through NATO countries because there's a diplomatic issue, right? Hungary is not on the side of the gay, right? So Hungary is kind of just making sure that it's trying to get rid of all of its ex-Soviet kit under the table. There are some other things that have changed. A lot more countries are giving material equipment to the Ukrainians, specifically like armor personnel carriers like the M113, which the United States doesn't really use as much anymore. That's all stuff that is being reaved out of the inventory, and so a lot of other countries are doing the same and getting rid of all of that stuff. And of course, so it's not just artillery. The Germans have committed to giving 15 Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft guns. They've committed to giving various forms of self-propelled artillery of differing calibers, MLRSs. Here's the other change that's happened is people are starting to give surface to air and anti-ship missiles to the Ukrainians. So the Germans are giving a surface to air battery, an Iris-T, which is supposed to be delivered in December, and Denmark, the UK, the Netherlands, the United States, and Sweden are all giving anti-ship cruise missiles, mostly Harpoon, but I think Sweden's giving the robot version, the Robot 17, which is a Swedish homebrew version of the Hellfire missile. And obviously the British are giving some surface-to-surface missiles as well. And that's in addition to all of the other stuff that's being given to the Ukrainians from the U.S. and Western powers. Which this is interesting because we mentioned Odessa, right? Because Putin has the strategic goal of taking Odessa. How are the Ukrainians going to defend Odessa, especially towards the sea, because the Ukrainian Navy has basically been wiped out at this point? Well, the answer is anti-ship cruise missiles of the Harpoon variety. And we saw what the Ukrainian homebrew missiles did to the Moskva a couple months ago. This is something that the Ukrainians are weak on. They don't really have like a lot of missiles in the inventory, so giving them missiles and launchers to launch them is a big change and allows Ukraine to prevent the Russians from coming too close into the littoral zone without risking being fired upon by anti-ship cruise missiles. So that's a distinct change from the last time we talked. The other thing I want to mention and highlight in terms of the material battle is the aircraft, right? Hungary is apparently giving, or has apparently given, 14 Su-25s. That's the Frogfoot, which is the old Soviet air-to-ground attack craft. Obviously, everybody's still giving UAVs, everybody's still giving loitering munitions, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that I find interesting here in terms of aircraft and helicopters that are coming from the old Soviet bloc countries, uh, I almost have the opinion that a lot of countries which stated that they weren't giving aircraft to the Ukrainians are probably are. And they're probably just doing so under the table without mentioning it at all. And the reason why I think this is because I've just been paying attention to the Ukrainian like air casualties, and they didn't start off with a lot of equipment in the beginning of the war in terms of aircraft, and like, all of that stuff was knocked out in the first week or two. And you still see reports of Ukrainian Su-25 here, Ukrainian helicopter there, and where are they getting all of this stuff? Well, they're getting it from other powers, and I think that that's like probably stuff that they've just been given without like official sanction or without official announcement, because there was this whole thing in the beginning where all of these Eastern Bloc countries are going to give the Ukrainians their MiG-29s. There's this whole scheme of giving MiG-29s to them, and that fell through. And I think that they've been given other pieces of equipment that are less decisive in the meantime. So we'll see what happens in the future.
Well, not only that, after like the first month and a half, the Ukrainian Air Force was almost totally wiped out. And now we're seeing reports of Ukrainian airframes flying again, which has led some people to think they're flying out of Romania.
Yeah, and that's a possibility as well, right? And we distinctly talked about this on our channel for this Russia update stuff, because there was, when they were discussing initially in the first month or so installing a no-fly zone, that was something that was on the table, right? The Western powers were discussing, okay, well, if we use MiG-29s, we can use Polish MiG-29s or whoever's MiG-29s and fly them out into Ukrainian airspace to provide air defense. And that was obviously a huge no-no, right? Because if you're using, NATO jets with NATO pilots and using NATO munitions flying from NATO airspace into an active war zone, you're basically declaring war on someone, right? So that's interesting if that is the case, without, basically doing all of that without admitting to it. So if Putin knows that that is the case, or knows that these things are being given to the Ukrainians without any sort of official fanfare, he's being very disciplined by just like letting it happen and just dealing with it tactically and just shooting them down as they come. So, which is his best option, really, because he doesn't need to make a big stink about all of this. He just needs to beat the Ukrainians in the field and to just overcome any sort of material help that's being given to them.
Definitely. I also love this material. It's very old, and there's been lots of reports of some of it being not in the best condition and having faults. So questionable about how great it was taken care of, and most of it anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting to see all of this like old Soviet kit, because there were discussions of in terms of casualties, and especially we've seen it's the exchanging of heavy war material, right? So you see the Russians like capturing a T-64, or the Ukrainians capturing a Russian T-72 or BMPs, etc., and then like putting another paint job on them, and then putting them right back into service in their forces. So like the equipment interoperability here is something that's hilarious to watch, because you like, and it's also very annoying because how do you determine whose tank that is if all of the identifying markers have been burned off? Well, you kind of don't. So who owns it originally? It kind of casts some doubt on casualties and that sort of thing. I doubt the numbers of captured vehicles are big enough to make that much of a difference, but it is kind of annoying when you see certain sources listing tank losses with the Soviet flag and instead of like the Russian or the Ukrainian one because it confuses the picture and I don't like it. So that's just my autism being irritated there.
Well, one thing that I think is really interesting about how this whole war has been reported is, let's look at the Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, and then the rise of ISIS in 2014. They were fairly detailed daily accounts of the combat front all the time. When this war started in Ukraine, I had a hard time finding daily updates on what was going on. And in fact, some patently false updates, like the Ghost of Kiev and the Snake Island incident. And what was interesting is there was a lot of Russian kit. Now, again, it's probably hasn't been deployed yet, though we don't really know one way or the other, like the T-14 Armada tank. We don't know how it's doing, if it's being deployed at all. And I think that's interesting that I don't know why Russia wouldn't report on it, because they want to keep secret their latest gizmos and gadgets. But I'm surprised that the Western media hasn't been reporting on their performance, because there was a lot of hype about the T-14 Armada and some of the other new Russian platforms that were being deployed, and I was interested in seeing how their performance was, but there's just nothing on it right now.
Yeah, I'm of the opinion that the T-14 Armada tank probably hasn't been deployed in Ukraine yet, and the reason why I think that is because you haven't seen any combat losses, nor have you seen any footage of one. So I think that the Russians are basically operating in accordance with their doctrine. Why would they waste, their most modern and quote unquote best assets in a war where they're fighting other T-72s and T-64s? Like, why? There's just no reason. So yeah.
The other thing is, recently one of Zelensky's advisors commented on the BBC that Ukraine was like losing approximately 200 men a day and 500 wounded.
Yeah, I saw that too.
That's bad. Like, you can't keep that up.
No.
I also heard they were losing an obscene amount of tanks daily as well.
Yeah. This is where it really comes down to material advantage, right? The West is attempting to restore some capability, not just in terms of artillery, but also in terms of mobility, right? Giving the Ukrainians at least some air capacity, right, with helicopters and Su-25s, right? Even though they're ground attack platforms, that's basically what the Ukrainians need, right? They need UAVs, they need manned spotter aircraft so that they can direct artillery fire more effectively. They need, they won't be able to totally contest, for the airspace just because they don't have the number of fighters to do that. But they need trucks, they need Humvees, they need tanks in order to be able to engage in any sort of maneuver warfare, right? So if you just don't have that, how are you going to support any sort of advance? Well, you're not. You're going to be limited to artillery and infantry, and if you don't have mobility, your guys are just going to end up getting encircled in a kettle formation again and again and again, and we keep seeing that. So it's playing out the way it is. That 200 KIA figure I find fascinating, just because that came from, if I remember correctly, that BBC article that came from one of the Ukrainian secretaries, somebody pretty high up. That's a pretty interesting breach of OPSEC, right? If that's the case, because we've really heard nothing from the Russians of what the official losses are, other than what their Ministry of Defense has put out. They've been very disciplined in that regard, and in the early stages, it was very difficult to get an accurate picture, just because the Ukrainians were throwing bullshit at the wall, and the Russians were just being tight-lipped and practicing good OPSEC, which is interesting, right? Because the Russians made this massive picture and the Russians were silent. So obviously, getting aid from the West is easier if you can make it seem like you're doing better than you really are, right? Which
No, it reminds me a lot of these ghost offensives that we keep hearing about. Ukraine's going to do another major offensive any day now. Keep hearing about these in Kharkov and Kherson. Keep hearing about how these offensives are going to take place and they never happen, or they're very tiny if they do happen.
I chuckle when I hear about those, and I look at the Institute for the Study of Wars maps because they all have claimed Russian offensives, and I'm like, okay, how much of that is actually an offensive, or is that just the Ukrainians just walking into territory that the Russians willfully gave them?
Yeah. I mean, it just seems at this point that the West is desperate to pour any types of weaponry to Ukraine because that's basically all they can do at this point.
Definitely, they can't really do much else. I mean, they've kind of already used their big move here, which was to send all this equipment, and it's being either destroyed, lost, or captured at rates that aren't very sustainable. This can't be sustained, sending constantly all this military equipment because even the West is running dry. Recently heard stories that even these stockpiles were running low of these, like the javelins and everything, and the in-laws, which some of these they don't even make anymore. They're just like flat out of them because they sent them all to Ukraine, and they're just being like captured or lost at rates that are unsustainable.
Yeah, one of the problems here is that with the Western production of these weapon systems, from what I can tell, they're sort of in these like batch contracts, which the bigger the batch, the cheaper the unit cost is. But up until the war with Russia, there really wasn't any cause for large batch orders. And Russia has 60, 70-year-old equipment in its arsenal that they never really got rid of, including the ammunition for it. So it's like, okay, we have all these cutting edge weapons, but we don't have the supply chains to keep them constantly armed and ready to go. Whereas Russia has a lot of weapons, many of which are technically obsolete, but are serviceable. So it's like, it doesn't matter how good the Javelin is if you don't have the missile to fire. And it doesn't matter, how good the M77 artillery is if you don't have the guided shell or the optical targeting system, neither of which were given to the Ukrainians.
Or not to mention the training on these weapon systems.
That too. So that's a problem. And when the German prime minister said he was going to increase the German defense budget by 100 billion euros, it's like, how long is that going to take to turn into anything useful? 2 years, 3 years? I mean, we don't know. And the question is, how long will Ukraine last before it folds? And then if Ukraine folds, which I think it will, I mean, in fact, we've seen a lot of the leadership, like Kissinger, say Zelensky's just going to have to give up territory. So we're beginning to see cracks in the leadership of the West saying that, okay, this might be a lost cause, guys. Let's just cut your losses and go. And I think the interesting question is if the West does tell Ukraine to fold, what's next? Will Putin make moves threatening the Baltic states? Who knows? I mean, he'd probably go to Moldova first because that's not a part of NATO. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens. And it's ridiculous. Or we think of like NATO. They have all of these countries, and yet their supply lines and their production is being stretched to breaking point by a relatively minor conflict that they're not directly involved in. What does that tell you?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I keep making parallels to the Falklands War for a reason, right? It's fascinating to watch the inventory of extremely sophisticated, precision weaponry stocks be depleted like relatively quickly, like within the first 2 weeks to the first month of a conflict, the first 2 months. I find that fascinating because, basically it just means that at the end of the day, you're going to eventually have to resort to using, dumb ammunition. And I find that hilarious because, it doesn't matter if you're using a 60-year-old 122 millimeter Soviet cannon, you still, it's still perfectly fine. And yeah. Yeah.
You also just have tons and tons of them. Russia has like the most tanks in the entire world, so they have tons of these. So it's like these like stories saying how Russia's running out of tanks is just, it's so ludicrous to me. They could lose probably tons of tanks a day and still have tons in reserve. I mean, they have like 12,000 active, I believe, tanks. Although I'm not sure in what condition those are in, but they still have 12,000. So, and those are just that they work. So you can just take that unit, replace it with another one, and it's pretty much good to go. And you could do that with tons of these old Soviet equipment. It's pretty interchangeable.
Also, with artillery, you can do the same thing. And I think artillery ages better than tanks in that regard. And so we've seen Russia pivot to a more artillery heavy strategy to disrupt some of these new missile systems that were coming online that were giving their tank crews headaches and some of the mistakes they made on the Kiev front. But again, it's what this really shows us is just the degradation of the NATO forces. This is not the NATO that sent troops to Afghanistan in 2001. This is not the United States that sent 150,000 troops to overthrow Saddam Hussein in 2003. This is a much weakened, hollowed out force. Part of it was due to 20 years in the sandbox. You might add to the adage, don't start a land war in Asia, don't start a land war in the sandbox. It's not going to end well. And then second of all, the sort of demoralization that has occurred throughout the West over the last 20 years, whereas Russia has sort of hardened under this like survival bunker mentality. So Russia perceives that it's going to lose a lot more if it loses than the West perceives. And so Russia's in it for the long haul in a way that the West doesn't seem to be willing to do, as we've seen with Afghanistan.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the resolve, right? That's the one thing that I'm particularly like I wouldn't say astonished by, but I definitely would admire that sort of quality that the Russians have that they're displaying right now. Their willingness to accept casualties and like the sheer ruthlessness of pulling out of a bad situation in Kiev when you'd already lost guys to take the ground in the north is fascinating to me that they're able to do that, because I could easily imagine the U.S. High Command would agonize over that kind of decision. I'm not sure that they'd be able to make that same call, or if they would, they might make it too late. After they had significantly committed, and then of course you get the sunk cost fallacy kicking in. So that's just something that I found fascinating.
Well, if the U.S. were doing it, they'd leave $80 billion of equipment for the Russians to pick up.
Oh, very good.
Yep.
They would make the Russians the most well-armed country in the world in Central Asia.
It would be our gift to them.
This is where you start seeing the bad sides of the American style of war, right? The American style of war likes to spend a lot of money, and obviously they don't like to take casualties since World War II for domestic stability reasons. But the Russians have no such qualms, right? And in fact, their doctrine is based upon the acceptance of casualties and losses. So how does the United States, when it's invested so much of its warfare doctrine in like precision warfare, deal with an opponent who's basically just going to be willing to accept material and human cost and just grind you down over the long term? And once all of your precision weapons are exhausted and you can't replace them, what do you do now? Like then it's just a sheer attrition fight, and the Russians are going to win that just through superiority of equipment.
Yeah, what a lot of this, I think, boils down to is in the 90s after the first Persian Gulf War, and then through the Audis with the second Iraq War, because Saddam's forces were using Russian/Soviet equipment, there was this sort of like cult attitude that, yeah, the Russians suck and we could totally beat them up because we beat Saddam Hussein. And it's like, he was diplomatically isolated in the first war. In the second war, he had been under sanctions for 20 years, or 15 years. Secondly, the Arabs are pathetic. The Israelis kick their ass all the time, outnumbered like 10-1, so who cares? And 3, they're not Russians. It's like...
Yeah, they're just comparing apples and oranges when you compare Russia and Saddam.
Exactly.
No, their ego is showing, their massive ego, that they can never lose any conflict because they think they're so superior that they've won in these their overwhelming advantages in weaponry against third world countries. It gives them this massive ego that they can defeat anything.
What this reminds me of is the old Irish revolutionary song, "Come Out, You Black and Tans." There's a line where it says, "Come out, you black and tans." You fought Arabs 2 by 2. You scared those damn natives to the marrow. It's easy to withstand 10 when you have a 16-pounder gun. And it's like, yeah, it's really easy to take on these people when you have heavy artillery and cutting edge weapons technology. But when you level the playing field to man in the streets shooting each other, it's a whole different game.
Yeah,
And we also have the other problem here where the Russians see themselves as a civilizational state, and they see Ukraine as historically part of the Russian nation. They see them as the same people, even though the Ukrainians don't see themselves now because of Western influence recently.
yeah,
So
we've definitely seen the Western mentality of this war because the West has been used to, defeating third world nations and crushing them to the point in which they think that they're invincible. And so, since they haven't really fought against a great power since World War II, they basically are now baffled as to how wrong they were, because when going against Russia, you're obviously going against a great power. You're going against a country that has the second most powerful military in the world, and that's willing to sacrifice its own men. And so it basically just changes up the ballgame now. And so, yeah, the West has basically just seen how wrong it's been up to now.
I think it's also important to bear in mind that the retired Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who has taken a very bullish view of the Western position in Ukraine, says that, at least from what he says, he's heard from ex-servicemen from the Marines and Special Forces who were observing the conflict, that if the U.S. sends troops there, they're going to get blown up. You're going to lose. That's what he says. So he's not popular for saying that, but McGregor says with the sources he has that the United States military is not in any condition to throw down with Russia today.
no, it is not. The competence of the U.S. military has just gone downhill ever since Afghanistan. Really, just been going downhill ever since they've been putting more incompetent people as well as gays in there. I mean, literally in charge of our military. They put a tranny in charge of our nukes. So competence of these people is just it's showing really with this Ukraine war. They think that they can win even though their incompetence and skills just go down every single year. So we're just really seeing how wrong they are. They really come home to bite them back with consequences, especially in Europe, with them all virtue signaling about they're not going to take Russian gas and how
that's going to be the next domino to fall in terms of American foreign policy powers. Like, what happens when Europe essentially gets what it wants in terms of weapons from defense contracts from the United States, and is able to do what they want from quote unquote rearmament, right? I get the feeling once they are able to get what they want, and they're able to, and they feel that they're able to defend themselves without the United States. I mean, the United States won't have nearly as much pull as they do in Europe as in years previous, which I hope that is going to be the case going forward, honestly. But we'll see.
I mean, if that happens, NATO will basically, I guess, become irrelevant, since at that point Europe will be more, I guess, unified and more independent, as opposed to just being a puppet of the U.S.
Well, it won't be unified. It'll just revert to historical norms. So it'll have, international competition between nations again, as opposed to, well, maybe not with the EU necessarily, but it'll open up space for people like us that wasn't previously there.
One thing that I think is interesting to add here too is a lot of these sales to European countries that are U.S. allies and a part of NATO, and also Southeast Asian countries of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. One of the things that I think this is one of the long-term criticisms that have been leveled against the fighter, is it's supposed to be a sort of Swiss Army knife, for all military operations that an airframe of its type could do. Now, the last time we had a large, air-ground war was in World War II. But even if we look at some of the smaller conflicts in the Cold War, like with India, Pakistan, and Israel and the Arabs, the one thing you never do is you never build an airplane that does everything, because it can't do everything. And I feel like that if the United States is doing this, and Russia and China are still building specialized airframes for interception, air superiority, attack support,
Ground
the
attack.
the F-35 is just going to get blown away because it's going to be tasked with too many roles that it can't perform.
And it's going to be so expensive that you're not going to have as many of them as you need. Whereas if you just made, designed to cost specific platforms designed for a unique purpose, then, the individual unit for each aircraft is going to cost less than, however much it costs to build an F-35, which is probably, it's ridiculous. I don't have the number on hand, but it's absolutely insane how much those things cost per unit.
The other thing, too, is seeing the use of precision munitions and all these missiles in Ukraine. Analysts have been saying that future wars, nations will use predominantly conventional dumb rounds, but they'll like shepherd and hoard precision munitions for the decisive moment that
Yes.
they perceive in the conflict, and then fire off all those and then just crush the enemy in the decisive moment, and then follow up with more conventional forces, because these precision guided munitions are just so expensive to produce and maintain that you can't fight a long war with those kinds of weapons.
No,
we
but
actually
they
saw this with the Azeri-Armenian conflict back in 2020 in the Caucasus, where the Azeris just broke through with their strategic weapons, their precision drones from Turkey. Those I don't know how you say them. I can't pronounce Turkish, but
The
those
Bakhtar.
Bakhtar drones. They just used those at once. They broke through the Armenians' lines in Nagorno-Karabakh that they had been fortifying. They just broke through them immediately, and that's why they lost that conflict so easily.
Yeah, the interesting thing about guided precision munitions is I can't recommend this book highly enough. It's the book about the Falklands War by Admiral Woodward. There's an interesting insight that he doesn't really touch on, but I just noticed that there's a distinct pulse to warfare these days now with precision weapons, just because of their cost and their limited capacity, availability. So nations have a restricted supply of these things in their inventories, and in the Falklands, the Argentinians absolutely had a limited supply of Exocet missiles. I think they only had 4 of them. So there's this weird pulse phase where you start out the conflict pretty hard and heavy with precision guided munitions, knockout C2 infrastructure, radars, things like that. All of these important military infrastructure, and then you go on to dumb rounds for a little bit, and then you just pump out dumb rounds, attrite the enemy, until you think you've got them where you want them, and then, like Praise of Folly said, at the decisive moment, then you unleash total hell with everything you've got, basically. So that's an interesting little aspect of the guided munitions warfare that I foresee going into the future, that warfare will have a very specific pulse, and there will be a very specific timing to the employment of these weapons.
And this is something we talked about when you and I were discussing with a Prudentialist. We're going to see a lot more cheaper, conventional, deployable platforms on air, land, and sea in the future. And they'll be the majority of a nation's armed forces. And these more expensive precision guidance platforms will still be around, but they're not going to be what everybody's using. They're going to be a reserve that you have. I mean, right now we're phasing out all the bombers, but the B-52. So the B-2's being phased out, the B-1's being phased out. There's supposed to be a stealth bomber called the B-21, which will replace the B-2. But really, they're all getting phased out, and the B-52 is still around. And that's from the 50s. So it's showing that these expensive platforms are just not, in the long run, sustainable in modern war.
No, and this is what you and I mentioned before on Prudentialist stream. You got to build it as if it's going to get blown up, right? They're just assets that are going to be destroyed. So spending and investing in every single like bell and whistle and every single little tool that you could possibly put on these things in terms of electronic warfare, that's all well and good for specific roles, but like expensive platforms are very, very expensive, and you just don't have the numbers in order to sustain conflict at a high intensity. So either you accept like conflict only at short, sharp, high intensity conflicts, or you go towards a more like mixed strategy, or you just assume like, okay, I'm just going to fight with dumb warfare for like extended periods of time.
Yeah, what we're seeing here, and it's a pattern that we've seen throughout history before, is this tendency to gargantuanism. So in antiquity, the Macedonians under Philip and Alexander perfected siege warfare, but their successors in the Diadochi War built gargantuan siege towers and catapults that were completely impractical for actual use. And the Romans ultimately overcame the Macedonian successors by having smaller, more realistic siege weapons that actually could achieve tactical results. And on the high seas, we saw gargantuan galleys with the quad and quinqueremes that were fighting in the First and Second Punic Wars, as well as some really just ridiculous ships, in the Eastern Mediterranean, again by Macedonian successors, that were just trophy ships. And by the time you get to Actium, the last major naval battle of antiquity, they're using like biremes again, two-decked galleys. They've completely given up on the gargantuan ships. And so we see that what happens is there's a trend that as something gets bigger and more powerful, it becomes more combat effective. But then there's the diminishing return, where if you just keep going up, it's not going to work. We saw this also with like Nazi Germany in World War II. King Tigers, Panthers, these are all very, it's pro towards gargantuanism. You had the Gustav, 80 centimeter mortar. So it's like, but those things weren't really that effective. Not in the long run, because they couldn't produce enough of them.
Well, actually, I would contest. I won't get into World War II history, but I would contest the effectiveness that you're asserting on the Tiger. That is absolutely an effective platform. It just wasn't mass produced enough, as you said. But it absolutely was combat effective in terms of its kill loss ratio, and same thing with the Panther. Anyway,
something I did want to get into before it is getting late here, so I do want to mention how we think this conflict is going to end. Obviously, it's not going to end well for Ukraine. The sheer amount of antagonism towards the Russian bear is going to have some payback. They're not going to get away scot-free from this. All the memes about Ukraine retaking Crimea and Donbass are just pure lunacy. Those are integral parts of Russia now. They're not going back without nukes being exchanged, shall we say. So one of my main theories about how this is going to end, once the Russians take the territory they want, either the coastline or to the Dnieper, as Mr. Mandra likes to say, we're going to have this rump Ukraine left. And a theory that, what's his name again on YouTube? Gonzalo Lira has, if you're familiar with him, is that Poland actually is posturing to retake western Ukraine around the city of Lviv, and Hungary wants to eat up some territory in that Transcarpathian Oblast. So how realistic do you think that is for those countries to pounce on this weakened Ukraine that's going to exist at some point?
I do think it is possible, because since they're Western countries, I do think the West will allow for them to basically take these areas of land, because they could basically just justify it by saying that, oh, we need to take over these areas of land because Ukraine is weakened, and like we need to use them in order to counter Russia. So I do think it is possible that they will try to take these parts.
I think it's possible too. So we already saw it in 1938 when Hitler partitioned Czechoslovakia. The region of Trans-Olza was given to Poland. So Poland has already shown itself to not be above partitioning countries, even though itself was partitioned. Furthermore, Lvov or Lviv was a part of Poland until after World War II. So Poland could plausibly make claims that this is or was a part of Poland, which would, I think, help sell that to a Western audience.
Yeah, the question I do have is what Russia would do with this rump Ukraine, because they obviously can't allow it to be a Western puppet state. So it'd have to be it would have to be friendly to them. I don't see how this rump Ukraine, like Galicia, Nordumeria, Kiev area, the historic like Western Ukraine that was part of Poland historically for the longest time, more Europeanized part of Ukraine. Russia allows to just be part of Western hands. So not quite sure what's going to happen there. Although I do see these terrorist countries, taking advantage of this, because they do want that territory back. There are irredentism in Europe. It still does exist, even though it is suppressed by, of course, the gay and other European institutions. So that's my theory about what's going to happen with this rump Ukraine. We could see Poland, trying to enlarge itself, and also Hungary. I don't think any other country, maybe Romania actually too. They do claim some parts of former Bessarabia and near Moldova border. That could be very interesting. They could all partition this rump Ukraine, and they probably would justify it too, because a pro-Russian administration would be in this rump Ukraine, so they would say that it was illegitimate.
Yeah, they could probably sell it to NATO, honestly. If rump Ukraine was unable to economically provide for itself, militarily defend itself, or politically be independent, I think NATO would rather, and in fact the EU and all these other internationalist institutions would rather see a rump Ukraine split up into these constituent parts and given to other places, and maintain at least strength in that those geographic areas with NATO, and prevent Russian influence as much as they could.
Definitely, we could see an attempt there, and I do think it would be very interesting to see lines change in Europe for the first time since after World War II, and of course the collapse of the Soviet Union. But this is more Eastern Europe. So it was an excellent stream with you, gentlemen. Is there anything you guys would like to show before we head out?
Yeah, sure. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can find me on Twitter. I have a Substack account, which I am writing articles for, which will be published eventually. And, I'm also on Gab, and you can talk to me on Twitter or Telegram.
And yeah, for me, I haven't been uploading on YouTube recently because of some issues, but I am working on a video. So yeah, I would hope that you guys could check that out. And you could also follow me on Twitter. My Twitter name is the same as my YouTube name, The Noble Crusader. And so yeah.
Yeah, follow me, subscribe and follow me on YouTube. Subscribe and support on Locals, and follow me on Twitter.
Yeah, thank you all gentlemen joining me to discuss this war and this conflict. And it was excellent having this discussion with you, Praise of Folly. I look forward to maybe having another discussion with you again.
No, thanks. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure to meet you all. And thank you for spending your time with me. If you enjoyed this first episode of Sitrep, episode 1, please like and subscribe. I greatly appreciate it. And have an excellent day. Excellent night.